Let me ask you to forget everything you think you know about ancient history. Forget the idea that early humans were primitive. Forget the belief that civilization slowly crawled forward in the dark. And forget the assumption that myths were invented to explain ignorance. Because, according to the oldest surviving texts on Earth, the earliest chapter of human history was not simple at all. It was controlled. Before governments, before borders, before nations even had names, the ancient world was already organized. Not by humans alone, but by beings described as older, stronger, and far more knowledgeable than the people who lived under them. This was the world before the flood, and the people who recorded it did not think they were writing legends. They believed they were preserving memory. The story begins in Mesopotamia, the land between two rivers. This region gave birth to writing itself, accounting, law, astronomy, engineering. The people here did not confuse fantasy with record. So when their clay tablets speak of a time before a catastrophic flood, we have to ask an uncomfortable question. Why would the inventors of written history lie at the very beginning of it? Among the most important discoveries ever made is a document known as the Sumerian King List. At first glance, it looks harmless. Just names, cities, reigns. But then you notice something that doesn't fit reality. The earliest kings ruled for tens of thousands of years. Not 10, not 100, but tens of thousands. Alulam ruled for 28,800 years. Alagar ruled for 36,000 years. These numbers are written with the same precision the Sumerians used for trade and mathematics. They are not poetic exaggerations. They are presented as fact. Modern historians quickly labeled this mythology. But the ancient scribes did something strange. They separated history into two eras: before the flood, after the flood. The flood was not a story to them. It was a line that divided reality. According to these tablets, kingship did not originate with humans. It descended from the heavens. That phrase appears again and again, not metaphorically, literally. Authority came from above. These early rulers were not described as ordinary men. They were intermediaries, connected to beings the Sumerians called. The term does not mean gods in the modern sense. It means those who came from the sky. The Anunnaki were not distant or invisible. They were present. They selected kings. They established laws. They controlled resources. Humans did not invent civilization on their own. They were instructed. This explains something that has always troubled archaeologists. Human civilization appears suddenly. Agriculture, writing, architecture, astronomy. These developments do not slowly evolve over tens of thousands of years. They explode into existence, as if knowledge was introduced, not discovered. The tablets describe these beings as teachers, but not gentle ones. They demanded obedience. They required labor. And they organized humanity into a system that benefited them. According to these records, early humans were not free. They were managed. Cities were laid out according to celestial patterns. Temples aligned with stars humans should not have understood yet. Calendars tracked complex astronomical cycles. This was not spiritual symbolism. It was applied science. So the question becomes unavoidable. Where did this knowledge come from? The Sumerians never claim they invented it. They say it was given as generations passed. The relationship between humans and these non-human rulers changed. What began as guidance slowly became interference, and interference became corruption. The tablets hinted boundaries being crossed, rules broken, experiments attempted. Humanity was no longer just being governed. It was being altered. These beings took human women. The texts are blunt about this. The result was not metaphorical. It was biological. Their offspring were different larger, stronger, unstable. The world began to change. Violence increased. The balance between humans, animals, and nature collapsed. This was not a peaceful golden age. It was an era spiraling out of control. Later civilizations inherited fragments of this memory. Names changed, details shifted, but the core truth survived. There was a time before, and it ended badly. Warnings appear in the texts, dreams, signs, instructions to preserve knowledge. The flood was not unexpected. It was anticipated. One man is chosen, not because he is perfect, but because something must survive. Memory. His name changes depending on the culture. Ziusudra, Utna Pistim, Noah, different names, same role. Same role? The flood was not described as a random natural disaster. It was described as a decision, a reset. When the waters finally came, they erased more than cities. They erased rulers. They erased creatures. They erased an entire way of life. When the flood receded, the world was quieter, smaller, human. But the memory remained, pressed into clay, hidden in scripture, disguised as myth. After the flood, stories begin to surface. Most people assume the danger came suddenly, but the ancient texts tell a different story. They say the world did not collapse overnight. It unraveled slowly, and the turning point came when knowledge crossed a line it was never meant to cross. As human civilization expanded under non-human oversight, a new kind of relationship emerged. The beings who once ruled from a distance began to intervene directly. They were no longer satisfied with teaching, agriculture, or governance. They wanted influence, control, participation. In later traditions, these beings are remembered by many names. In Sumer, they were powerful sky entities. In Hebrew tradition, they became known as the Watchers. In other cultures, they appear as shining beings, messengers, or fallen gods. Different names, same presence. The Book of Enoch describes the Watchers not as symbols, but as they observed humanity. They judged it, and eventually, they chose to interfere. According to the text, the Watchers descended to earth with intention, not to protect, but to take. They crossed a boundary that even ancient writers considered forbidden. They shared knowledge humans were not ready for. The secrets of metalworking and weapon creation, advanced astronomy, chemical manipulation, techniques that altered nature itself. This knowledge did not elevate humanity. It destabilized it. Weapons multiplied faster than wisdom. Power spread without restraint. And violence became organized. But the most dangerous knowledge was not technological. It was biological. The Watchers took human women, not as metaphor, not as allegory. Exon. What followed was described as a violation of natural order. The offspring were called Neo. They were not simply tall humans. They were fundamentally different. The texts describe them as massive in stature, unmatched in strength, and incapable of restraint. They grew faster than resources could support them. They consumed endlessly. At first, they dominated animals, then crops, then entire communities. The ancient writers describe a world being eaten alive. Humanity was caught between fear and obedience. These beings were stronger, smarter, and partially divine. Resistance was impossible. As the Nephilim spread, the balance of the world collapsed. Animals behaved unpredictably. Nature itself became hostile. The earth, according to the texts, was corrupted. This corruption was not moral alone. It was physical. The boundaries between species blurred. Life no longer followed its original design. Ancient texts describe hybrid creatures, not just giants, but beings that were part animal, part human, creatures that should never have existed. Later generations would call these myths, but the earliest writers described them with warning, not wonder. They were not proud of this era. They feared it. Violence became constant. Bloodshed was normal. Human life lost its value, and the Watchers lost control of what they had created. This is where the tone of the ancient texts shifts dramatically. The beings who once ruled with authority now faced consequences, not from humans, but from forces greater than themselves. According to the Book of Enoch, judgment was declared. The Watchers were accused. Their actions had endangered the entire world. Some were bound. Some were imprisoned. Some were destroyed. But their offspring remained. The Nephilim did not disappear immediately. They continued to roam the earth, and their presence ensured that the world could not return to balance. The texts describe desperation, attempts to restore order, warnings delivered through visions and dreams. Humanity was told what was coming. Cleansing. A reset. But before that reset, one final attempt was made. Knowledge had to be preserved, not the forbidden kind, but the memory of what went wrong. This is why one man is warned, not because he is perfect, but because he listens. He is told to prepare, to build, to gather life. The flood is no longer described as punishment. It is described as containment, a necessary act to prevent total annihilation. By this point, the world is beyond repair. The Nephilim dominate. The Watchers are removed. Humanity stands on the edge of extinction. The ancient writers do not celebrate what comes next. They mourn it, because the flood would erase more than monsters. It would erase knowledge, history, entire civilizations. As the waters rise, cities vanish, temples disappear, records dissolve, and the last witnesses to the pre-flood world aside. When the flood finally ends, something fundamental is gone. The world feels smaller, less vibrant, less dangerous, but also diminished. Human lifespans shorten, knowledge fragments, the connection to the sky fades. What remains are stories. Distorted, sanitized, rebranded as myth. But the fear embedded in those stories never disappears, because humanity remembers on some level what it once lived through. A time when gods were real, when monsters walked openly, when the world itself had to be wiped clean to survive. And that fear leads directly into the final chapter, the aftermath, the rewriting of history, and the silence that followed. By the time the world reached its final days before the flood, something was deeply wrong, not just morally, but structurally. Ancient texts don't describe a world that was simply sinful. They describe a world that was corrupted at its core. Humans were no longer fully human. Animals were no longer natural, and the earth itself was no longer stable. The Book of Enoch says the Watchers didn't just teach forbidden knowledge, they changed life itself. Creatures were altered. Bloodlines were mixed. Nature was rewritten. This wasn't just rebellion. It was contamination. According to these manuscripts, God didn't decide to destroy the world out of anger. He made the decision because the original design of creation was being erased. If it continued, nothing pure would remain. Why? The flood was inevitable. Ancient writers described the flood not as punishment but as a reset. The giants consumed everything. When food ran out, they turned on humans. When humans were gone, they turned on each other. The earth became violent beyond repair. Even the Watchers themselves realized they had gone too far. They begged for forgiveness, but it was too late. The texts say their knowledge had already spread. Their creations already walked the land. Their influence had already poisoned the future. Only one bloodline remained uncorrupted. Noah, not because he was perfect, but because his lineage was still genetically intact. That detail matters more than people realize. The ark was not just a boat. Modern thinking reduces the ark to a wooden ship filled with animals. Ancient texts describe something far more complex. The ark was a preservation vault. It carried clean human genetics, unaltered animals, seeds of the original world. The goal wasn't survival. The goal was restoration. When the waters came, they didn't fall gently. The manuscripts describe the ground splitting open, oceans rising from below, the sky collapsing from above. Civilizations vanished in days. Cities built by giants gone. Knowledge etched in stone buried. Creatures that no longer belonged wiped out. History didn't just drown. It was erased. After the flood, a smaller world. When the waters receded, the survivors stepped into a world that felt different. The atmosphere had changed. Human lifespans dropped dramatically. Creatures were smaller, weaker, limited. The age of gods and giants was over, but not forgotten. The survivors carried memories, fragments of the old world. Those memories became myths. The watchers became gods. The giants became monsters. Advanced cities became legends. And the truth was slowly diluted. Why? History says they never existed. Here's the uncomfortable part. If the pre-flood world was real, then modern history isn't incomplete. It's edited. A civilization before civilization challenges everything. Evolution, time, human origin, religious interpretations, scientific comfort zones. So the safest option was dismissal. These are myths. These are symbolic. These creatures never existed. But myths don't appear on every continent with the same details. Flood stories exist everywhere. Giants exist everywhere. Lost golden ages exist everywhere. That's not coincidence. That's memory. The final question. The manuscript doesn't end with answers. It ends with a warning. It says knowledge can elevate humanity or destroy it. That not all progress is safe. That some doors once opened cannot be closed. The pre-flood world didn't fall because it lacked intelligence. It fell because it crossed a line. And the final sentence is haunting. What was erased once can be repeated again if mankind forgets why the flood came.